Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today on our webinar. Today we have the chair and the vice chair of the Appraiser Qualifications Board. They will be summarizing the board's proposed changes to the criteria. Brad and then Jerry, would you like to introduce yourselves real quickly?
Thanks, Lisa. Hello, everyone. Thanks for your time attending this webinar today. I'm Brad Swinney, Chair of the Appraiser Qualifications Board. I'm a certified general appraiser based in Austin, Texas. I've been practicing appraisal for 31 years, with the last 26 of those years in the farm credit system.
And hello, everybody. We're glad you're here. I'm Jerry Urich, the Vice Chair of the Appraisal Qualifications Board. I am a certified residential appraiser based in Ohio, and I've been practicing appraisal for over 35 years, and I'm presently employed by a large national bank.
Great, thank you guys. And I, Lisa Damaris, am the Vice President of Appraisal Issues here at the Appraisal Foundation. I am the technical expert that serves to the ASB and the AQB, and I was an appraiser for 30 years prior to coming here. I know it's hard to believe I'm that old. All right, so webinar logistics, I'd like to go through these very quickly, just in case this is the first time you've been here. We are recording the webinar, and you can see the recording will post to our YouTube channel in about 24 hours. We typically, if we have time, and we often do, take questions at the very end of the webinar as time permits. So think of your questions as you have them and put them in the question and answer box, or put them in the chat box. We have two boxes down there. We recommend that you keep your chat box open because we provide information to you as we go along. And then you can use the Q&A box to ask your questions. We like to ask you to try and put those questions in the Q&A box because we've got so much to toggle back and forth between, but we will try and keep up with the chat box as well if you happen to post them in that box. At the conclusion of the webinar, we always have a really quick survey. We love that people fill those out, and a lot of you do. They always help us improve our webinars, so they take like 2 minutes. So we really appreciate when you all do that. Now, for our agenda today, we're going to be discussing the proposed edits to the criteria to require valuation bias in fair housing laws and regulations, education, and a few other areas of the criteria. Brad and Jerry will do their best to explain the rationale for the proposed changes issued by the board. And as always, I like to bring up, part of this whole process depends very deeply and very heavily on you providing your comments to these drafts. So we do have a lot of different ways you can provide those comments. Once you have obtained your copy of the exposure draft, you can note that if you have it on your computer, we've designed the exposure draft to be very user-friendly in that format. With it open, you can either email us your comments, so the email address is right there in the exposure draft, or again, on the computer, you can click on the comments link, and that takes you right into a platform where you can directly either upload any document you want, or you can put in any comments you want about the draft. Thank you very much. And with that, let's get started. Brad, can you tell us what the attendees should expect from today's webinar?
Thanks, Lisa. Jerry and I will go over the proposed changes shown in the second exposure draft in detail, and we will also take your questions. We hope to answer most of your questions with this presentation. The Appraiser Qualifications Board is tasked with maintaining the real property appraiser qualification criteria, as well as the personal property appraiser qualification criteria. These documents are updated in response to the needs of clients, intended users, and the public to ensure the criteria in place meaningfully develops an appraiser's professional knowledge and skills. Before going into the proposed changes, I think it's important for you to know how the board got here. As background, concerns relating to discrimination, fair housing law violations, and real property appraisals have become important topics across the housing industry and the appraisal profession. While these are complex issues, many of which go beyond the scope of the criteria, a wide range of stakeholders have urged the AQB to require, as part of both an appraiser's qualifying and continuing education, courses on valuation bias, fair housing laws, and regulation. The board has been closely analyzing the White House task force known as PAVE, or Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, action plan since its release last year. The AQB began analyzing and implementing recommendations made by the PAVE report aimed at rooting out appraisal bias and building public trust. The AQB is proud that much of its ongoing work aligns with the report's recommendations. In response to stakeholders, the board held a public forum in September regarding the need to require fair housing and valuation bias education for appraisers. The board heard from and listened to panelists from various stakeholder groups, including federal agencies, state appraiser regulatory agencies, education providers, professional appraisal organizations, and consumer, civil rights, and fair housing advocacy groups. The board also took public comments. As a summary of that forum, the oral and written comments received from the panelists were largely in full support of requiring fair housing education for current and aspiring appraisers. Following this forum, the board held a working group to meet with state appraiser regulatory agencies, professional appraisal organizations, education providers, and appraiser coalitions, and again, consumer, civil rights, and fair housing advocacy groups to ask questions and receive feedback on what exactly these education requirements should contain. The board then drafted the current exposure draft we're discussing here today. That exposure draft, as just noted, evolved after receiving considerable feedback and input from multiple different types of stakeholders. The board issued the first exposure draft on January 31st with a comment period ending on March 13th of 2023. The AQB received substantive feedback. Groups providing feedback included the Foundation's Advisory Council, which consists of 60 nonprofit organizations and government agencies. We also heard from the State Regulatory Advisory Group, which is open to state regulators from all 55 states and territories. The board issued the second exposure draft on May 17, 2023. Most of the proposed changes have remained the same as in the previous draft, except two areas, and we will discuss those in a bit. Today, Jerry and I will explain the proposed changes and hopefully either get your thoughts and comments on these changes today or encourage you to submit your comments before the comment period ends on June 20th, 2023. Your feedback is of crucial importance to the work we are doing, and we hope you are able to provide comments to the AQB for our consideration. In this second exposure draft, the AQB continues to propose the changes with a slight modification based on feedback from stakeholders. The board has received some recurring questions during the first exposure draft. So we've added 15 questions and answers into the rationale of the second exposure draft. Time permitting, we will try to answer some of those questions in today's presentation. Let's now turn to the second exposure draft and what it is currently proposing. So in adding qualifying education and continuing education requirements for coursework in valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulation, it continues every profession undergoes change, which often stems from issues that arise in practice. Appraisal bias is an important issue that affects public trust. The AQB strongly feels that to reinforce and maintain public trust, it is necessary to ensure all appraisers know and understand their obligations under all applicable anti-discrimination laws. For this reason, the AQB is proposing all credentialed appraisers have focused education in valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations. Regardless of the type of work an appraiser may choose to practice, a licensed residential, certified residential, or certified general credential qualifies that individual to complete appraisal assignments to which fair housing laws and regulations might apply, subject to also meeting the requirements of the competency rule and use path. Even if an appraiser chooses to never complete an assignment where fair housing law or regulation applies, they must understand these laws because their credential qualifies them to complete those assignments. Additionally, because avoiding valuation bias is a key aspect of appraisal practice, the AQB believes specifically requiring focused education on this topic is imperative to ensure the public trust now and going forward. While many appraisers have at least some education and training related to valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations, this AQB proposed training consists of specific topics every appraiser must complete. Concerning the revision and update of the name for the 7-hour National Use PAP update course and the 7-hour instructor recertification course. The AQB is continuing to propose updating the name of the 7-hour National Use PAP update course to 7-hour National Use PAP continuing education course. The AQB is also proposing the removal of the 7-hour from the title of 7-hour instructor recertification course. The proposed changes better reflect the purpose and content of the courses. We also have some minor edits. On page 16 of this exposure draft, a few minor edits, while largely administrative in nature and made solely for the purpose of clarification, are also proposed for change. The edits do not result in any substantial change to the criteria. If adopted at our June 22nd, 2023 public meeting, this second exposure draft will result in new criteria, with those changes becoming effective January 1 of 2026. This effective date change extends the time period for implementation by 1 year as compared to the first exposure draft. Concerns were directly expressed by the states and from the appraisal subcommittee that an effective date of January 1, 2025 did not allow an adequate time period for the changes to be successfully implemented by states. Each state has different regulatory processes, with some taking up to 2 years or more to amend their laws and regulations. Extending the date by 1 year allows sufficient lead time, providing states the ability to implement these criteria changes. AQB would encourage all states to implement the changes as quickly as possible upon adoption.
Thank you, Brad. I am looking at the second exposure drafts, and the proposed changes start with changes to continuing education, which we call CE requirements. Continuing education is the education appraisers have to complete every so often to be able to maintain their credential. Jerry, can you walk us through these changes related to CE?
Yes, thanks, Lisa. The AQB is proposing to revise the current continuing education requirements. So currently, an appraiser must take a 7-hour USPAP course once every 2 calendar years and take the equivalent of 14 class hours of instruction in courses or seminars for each year of their renewal cycle. For example, a 2-year continuing education cycle would require 28 hours to be completed by the end of their renewal cycle. So in other words, every 2-year period in an appraiser's continuing education cycle currently requires 28 hours of continuing education, of which 7 hours must be obtained from successfully completing the 7-hour National USPAP update course. This existing requirement allows the appraiser to choose how they obtain the other 21 hours of mandatory continuing education. The AQB is proposing to require a portion of those remaining 21 hours be allocated to evaluation process, to the valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations course. So the AQB concurred with the stakeholder feedback that we have 2 distinct or mutually exclusive continuing education requirements for valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations of education. The proposed continuing education requirements are appraisers must successfully complete a course which meets the AQB's content requirements of the valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations outlined every 2 calendar years. The first time an appraiser completes the continuing education requirement for this course, the course length must be 7 hours. If an appraiser successfully completed a 7-hour plus a 1-hour exam course as part of their qualifying education, they have met this requirement. Every 2 calendar years thereafter, the course length must be at least 4 hours. The difference between the 7-hour course and the 8-hour course is the 8-hour course includes a required 1-hour exam. Therefore, the 8-hour course is the same identical course as the 7-hour course, with 1 extra hour added to allow for an exam to be administered. The goal is to provide in-depth and detailed education for all credentialed appraisers on the topics of valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations, with content that matches what is expected in a QE course on the same topic. Once the appraiser has completed the initial course and gained core knowledge of these topics, The appraiser will need to complete a 4-hour refresher course every 2 years.
Great. Thanks for that great explanation, Jerry. Brad, now that we know the proposed requirements for current appraisers related to CE, can you tell us what education requirements the aspiring appraisers are going to need to complete, which is QE?
Yes, Lisa. First, let me start by saying that the proposed changes to the QE qualifying education remain the same as the first exposure draft. The AQB is proposing to add an additional course requirement to the list of required qualifying education courses for each appraisal classification: the trainee, licensed residential, certified residential, and certified general. This core course will provide a baseline of knowledge for all appraisers on topics of valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations. The 8-hour course must be part of the required qualifying education for aspiring appraisers no later than January 1, 2026. For the certified residential and certified general qualifying education requirements, it was possible to propose adding the 8-hour course without increasing the total number of qualifying education hours. This was possible because the AQB is proposing to reduce the total number of required elective hours accordingly. While only one requirement is changing, an 8-hour course included to all qualifying education requirements, this change results in multiple areas of the criteria needing to be edited to reflect the proposed change and the total hours required increasing for the trainee classification and for the licensed residential credential. Here on your screen is the first area of change, adding the exception for the 8-hour course on valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations. On the next 8 slides, we will see proposed changes to the hours for each credential. So we will go through these fairly fast. Because the trainee classification and the licensed residential classification have no elective hours required in their existing qualifying education requirements, it was not possible to add additional requirements without increasing the total number of qualifying education hours required for these classifications. Here, for the trainee, it is an increase from 75 hours to 83 hours. To clarify, these are not actual, or these are actual hours, they are not semester hours. So these are classroom hours. Thus, for example, if a student uses 40 hours a week as their measure, it will take just over 2 weeks to complete all their QE requirements. The increase in the number of hours is minimal in relation to the benefit of the student gaining important education in valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations. Here on this slide, you see the addition of the 8-hour course to the required core curriculum and criteria. The licensed residential increases from 150 to 158 hours of qualifying education, which is also amended in the required core curriculum by adding the course and the total number of hours. For certified residential, if you are a trainee and are aiming to get your certified residential credential, the subject matter electives are decreased to 12, which brings the total hours needed to 117 beyond the trainee classification. If you are a licensed residential, the hours have also decreased from 20 to 12 on the electives, and the total additional hours needed from LR to CR goes from 50 to 42. Now for the certified residential and the certified general qualifying education requirements. It was possible to propose adding the valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations course without increasing the total number of qualifying education hours. In the required core curriculum, we have added the 8-hour class and decreased the electives. If you are a trainee aiming for certified general credential, you will need 22 hours of electives, which brings the total of additional hours to 217 hours. If you are a licensed residential aspiring to the certified general, you will need 22 hours of electives and a total additional hours of 142 hours. Lastly, we have updated the required core curriculum by adding the course and decreasing the elective hours. So that is the end of the proposed changes to the qualifying education in the criteria.
Great. Thank you very much, Brad. We have now arrived in the course outline, and we will hear what is going to be proposed to be in this course. Jerry, can you start us off with answering this question? Did the AQB develop the course outline in consultation with experts? And can you tell me exactly who provided feedback to the AQB?
Yes, thanks, Lisa. The outline was developed considering the direct advice received from fair housing experts, legal professionals with expertise in fair housing laws, and the production of education-related materials. Participants included representatives of fair housing advocacy groups, civil rights experts, federal agencies, education providers, appraiser membership organizations, and state regulatory agencies. Additionally, revisions have been made in the second exposure draft based on comments on the first exposure draft received from such entities, including federal regulatory bodies. To view one of the public forums held on this topic, check out the recording on the Foundation's YouTube channel titled Forum to Explore Education Requirements, Fair Housing Laws, and Valuation Bias Education. The goal of this proposed outline is to provide high quality, consistent, and uniform education for all appraisers on the topics of valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations. As previously discussed, the AQB received positive stakeholder feedback in support of proposing an outline for the valuation bias, the fair housing laws and regulations course in the criteria. The panelists at the forum provided written answers to one of the AQB questions to list the required topics for the course. The AQB received and reviewed the extensive list of topics for the course content. The AQB reviewed current course outlines available on this topic for their required content from various state agencies and education providers. The AQB also received comments from stakeholders at various meetings and speaking engagements, such as the Appraisal Foundation Advisory Council, Industry Advisory Council, and Association of Appraiser Regulatory Officials. The AQB asked for greater feedback from the pre-exposure draft working group. The working group's comments further refined the required outline. Lastly, the AQB received advice from fair housing attorneys on the required outline. This proposed outline was modified slightly from the first exposure draft, explicitly to include the topics of disparate impact and disparate treatment. Here on your screen is the start of the outline, noting that the course must contain information to ensure the appraiser understands valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations related issues. The same outline is required for the 7-hour course, the 8-hour course, which is the 7-hour course plus 1 hour for the exam, and the 4-hour course. However, the 4-hour course will have less content on the topics of understanding real estate bias and federal fair housing laws and regulations, and more content on valuation bias and case studies. It also starts off with the requirement for education providers to have the topics on the following slides. Here is a list of topics on the understanding real estate bias in its historical and contemporary context. Next, we have federal fair housing and anti-discrimination laws and regulations. Note that this is where we added disparate impact and disparate treatment. In this section, one will learn about the different components of valuation bias and how to recognize and avoid it. Lastly, the board thought it important to have discussions of case studies.
Great information, Jerry. Brad, can you tell us a bit more about guide notes and the proposed changes to guide note 1?
Yes, Lisa. The AQB issues guide notes, which provide additional guidance to users of the criteria, such as aspiring appraisers and regulators. This section remains unchanged from the first exposure draft to the second exposure draft. The edits to guide note 1 will consist of adding high-level required outline in a format that is consistent with the rest of the guide note. Therefore, the outline in the guide note for valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulation course outline is necessarily more abbreviated than it appears in the criteria. The criteria contains the full requirement to be met, and the guide note contains a condensed outline. The board is also proposing a change to this title on your screen to be consistent with the new proposed course. This falls under the heading of basic appraisal principles in the guide note.
Perfect. Thanks, Brad. And now, Jerry, back to you. Can you tell us a bit about these proposed changes to the course titles in the criteria that Brad talked about earlier?
Of course, Lisa. This section remains the same as proposed in the first exposure draft. To better reflect the intent and objectives of the course, the AQB is proposing to change the name of the course to 7-hour National USPAP Continuing Education Course. The AQB is also proposing the removal of the 7-hour from the title of the 7-hour instructor recertification course. Originally, when the course was only held in person, it was a 7-hour course. The course has evolved over the years and is currently often fewer than 7 hours in length. So the proposed change better reflects the purpose and content of the courses.
Thank you both Brad and Jerry for taking us through the exposure draft. And we do have some questions coming in, but before we get to those, I have got a list of questions that we have compiled, and I wanted to go through those with each of you. So Jerry, I'd like to start with you, and here is the question for you. Why is the AQB taking the approach of proposing requirements where all real property appraisers complete education on fair housing laws and regulations, regardless of the property type that each individual appraiser may choose to focus on in their practice? For example, residential, commercial, industrial, that kind of thing.
Okay. So regardless of the type of work an appraiser may choose to practice, a licensed residential, certified residential, or general certified credential qualifies that individual to complete appraisal assignments to which fair housing laws and regulations might apply, subject to also meeting the requirements of the competency rule in USPAP. Even if an appraiser chooses to never complete an assignment where a fair housing law or regulation applies, they must understand these laws because their credential qualifies them to complete those assignments. Additionally, because avoiding valuation bias is a key aspect of appraisal practice, the AQB believes specifically requiring focused education on this topic is imperative to ensure the public trust now and going forward. While many appraisers have at least some education and training related to valuation bias and/or fair housing laws and regulations, this AQB proposed training consists of specific topics every appraiser must complete.
Perfect. Thanks, Jerry. Brad, here's another question for you. As an appraiser who is also a realtor, can I use the fair housing education I receive through the National Association of Realtors to meet the AQB's proposed education requirements?
Good question. A realtor-centered fair housing course typically has different content than what is being proposed for appraiser education on this topic. However, if the course is approved in the state and meets the required content of the valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations outlined, then the course will meet those proposed education requirements.
Thank you. And Jerry, back to you. Has the AQB considered, instead of a standalone QE course in valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations, that all of the QE courses be modified to include this topic throughout all existing materials in every appraisal course?
Yes, the AQB explored this option and concluded it was not the best course of action, and it created practical implementation challenges. These topics are better understood and taught in a course that is solely focused on these issues. Additionally, it would be onerous for course providers to weave this topic into their existing courses. Further, if the topic was interspersed throughout existing education, it would be challenging for course providers and appraisers to ensure adequate education on all necessary aspects of the topic, and challenging for regulators to track how every appraiser was trained on all required valuation bias and fair housing laws regulations content.
Thank you. And Brad, why not just add this material to the USPAP courses?
USPAP contains the ethical standards and competency requirements for individual appraisers, and the accompanying courses are designed to teach those standards and competency requirements. Anti-discrimination is one of many issues addressed within USPAP. With the recent adoption of the changes to the ethics rule in USPAP, future courses will address this issue as one component of USPAP. However, a focused fair housing course is necessary to ensure adequate training. A combined course, USPAP plus fair housing plus valuation bias, would not be able to present the level of detail needed for an appraiser to adequately understand this important subject while maintaining a sufficient focus on other areas of USPAP.
Thank you. Jerry, instead of requiring more QE, can the AQB just increase enforcement of bias in fair housing and lending related issues?
No. While enforcement is a key factor in the success of any law and regulation, Lisa, neither the AQB nor the foundation are entities authorized to enforce law.
Short and sweet. Great answer. Thank you. Brad, the course outline only teaches federal fair housing laws. Shouldn't the course outline also require the teaching of individual state laws?
Well, Lisa, the proposed course requirement reflects content that is relevant on a national level. The federal law sets the minimum requirement for appraisers nationwide. It would not be possible for the foundation to design training that includes material from all states and territories. However, appraisers are required by USPAP to comply with all applicable laws and regulations, including state and local anti-discrimination laws, and should seek training through state-level courses, state regulatory agencies, and other available resources. Also, many states require appraisers to take a state-approved course that specifically teaches laws relevant to the appraiser working in that state. The AQB could not develop a national standard that requires different content for the different states and territories. Additionally, under USPAP, appraisers are responsible to comply with the competency rule and follow any applicable law or regulation, including those that apply only to the small jurisdiction where a subject property is located.
Jerry, since the course will cover fair housing laws and regulations, which is a specialized topic, will the AQB have requirements for qualifying each course instructor?
Lisa, there are only 2 instances where the AQB has instructor qualifications for QE or CE courses. In the first instance, the AQB trains, tests, and certifies instructors who teach courses on USPAP, which is the foundation's publication. In the second instance, if an education developer submits a course to the AQB's Course Approval Program, or CAP, they are doing so knowing they will follow the CAP policies. CAP policies do have requirements related to instructor qualifications. However, education providers are not required to submit their courses to CAP for approval because they may submit their courses directly to the state. States may choose to have instructor qualification requirements for any courses submitted to them.
Brad, the proposed course contains complex legal content that will require specific expertise. Will the AQB's CAP policies that Jerry just mentioned employ experts to review and approve the course material related to the laws and regulations?
Well, again, and as Jerry just said, education providers are not required to submit their courses to CAP for approval. However, because expertise in fair housing laws and regulations is important, CAP policies are in the process of being discussed and updated. Right now, discussions center on the possibility of implementing a requirement that any material related to fair housing laws and regulations be reviewed and approved for legal accuracy before a course is submitted to CAP. If this type policy is adopted, CAP will employ experts in the subject to assist in this determination, and ample time will be given to education developers to understand how they will be required to demonstrate in a CAP submission that their legal content is correct. We imagine any policy we develop can help state regulators as well. States that choose to review and approve these courses on their own can choose to follow a similar process. As noted, these updated policies are still in development. We welcome your feedback on this issue.
Great. So thank you, Brad. And we have one more of these questions, and then I'm going to go into the Q&A in the chat box and see what we can answer from there. So Jerry, the last question from this set is, why is the AQB proposing the 4-hour course to have less coverage of topics such as understanding real estate bias and federal fair housing laws?
Well, Lisa, the intent is to allow for the 7-hour course to address core principles of the proposed content, and for the 4-hour course to be practice-based, focusing more on examples, case studies, or emerging issues. This will ensure that appraisers receive a well-rounded education, with some content required being base level knowledge, while other content focuses on applying an implementation of that knowledge.
Great. Thank you, Jerry. Sorry, I was just pausing there. I'm reading some of the comments here in the chat box and whatnot. I'm just going to try and summarize these as quickly as I can, and I'll start with Brad. Can you comment on, technically QE courses must be 15 hours in length, and how the AQB has addressed that issue? I know you mentioned that, but just to reiterate that a little bit.
Certainly. We've already gone through how we consulted through forums and working groups, and ongoing feedback from our sponsoring organizations and the public on the content of the fair housing and valuation bias courses we're proposing to implement. Along with that, we also obtained feedback on the required links to provide adequate coverage of the topic. And we ended up settling for QE on 8 hours, which was the 7-hour course plus 1-hour exam based on this feedback. Knowing that up to this point for qualifying education, the minimum length was 15 hours. AQB determines that minimum length, and it didn't seem wise or it just didn't seem wise to try to add an additional 7 hours to the course just to get it to 15 hours, when all the feedback we obtained indicated that 7 hours plus the 1-hour exam would provide adequate coverage and time for the exam.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brad. Jerry, I'm going to ask you a question about the proposed effective date if this is adopted. And that is, the comment here is about that 2026 really does not express the state of urgency. And I'm kind of going to add on to the comment the person has in here, and that is, in the past, there are times when you adopt changes to the criteria you make effective immediately. So why is there that discrepancy between adopting something that goes into effect immediately, and then why can't you adopt something as of 2025 for this? Kind of a big question there.
Well, as we mentioned previously in the webinar here, we certainly do want to encourage states to adopt as early as possible, but we do recognize that states have certain legislatures that don't meet every year. They meet every 2 years or even beyond that. So requiring the criteria change to be effective immediately really puts these states kind of at a disadvantage. In fact, that they aren't allowed to, they can't really adopt and take advantage of these regulations until their own legislatures actually approve them. So we recognize that, and also we did receive a lot of feedback from stakeholders, including the ASC, our appraisal subcommittee, so saying that, look, you need to give the states time to adopt this. But again, we certainly encourage course providers to start developing content based off, developing courses based off of our required content, and we certainly encourage all states to adopt as quickly as possible.
Brad, do you have anything to add to that? Just checking before I move on to the next question.
Jerry covered it really well. The only thing I would add is that along with the schedule of various state legislatures, renewal cycles also factor into this. And states have varying lengths of renewal cycles. even beyond those of their legislatures.
Great, thank you. Brad, and this next question is for you. Why isn't the AQB educating the public about valuation bias in fair housing laws and regulations?
Well, AQB, our mission, if you will, our mandate under FIREA is to provide minimum qualifications in the area of education, experience, and exam for appraiser credentials, specifically real estate appraisal credentials. So while we welcome public comment, and we would hope the public would attend webinars and read our newsletters or visit our website, our concentration remains on appraisers.
Perfect. And before I go to the next question for Jerry, because it's about PREA, I wanted to ask Brad a quick question about PREA. Do you have any announcement you'd like to make about PREA?
No, I have no announcement other than we have recently approved, and this is an announcement that the Appraisal Institute rightfully made first, if you will. But we approved the Appraisal Institute's licensed residential PREA module to move forward and be offered publicly to aspiring appraisers. So they are in the process of rolling that out presently, but it does have AQB approval.
Announcement, even though it's already out there, I just want to make sure everybody knew that. So Jerry, this question is for you about PREA. Will the requirements to participate in a PREA program remain at 150 QE hours, or will they change?
I think that really is one of those answers where you say it depends. It depends on when the participant takes PREA. If they take PREA and the new criteria is in effect, then yes, they would have to adhere to the new education requirements for qualifying education, including the new valuation bias and fair housing laws and regulations course. But if they take PREA and they start to go through PREA before this has been enacted, obviously they follow the current requirement.
Okay, great. I guess we still have another comment about the proposed effective date. I don't know if there's anything more we can add about that, but people are saying, why can't we just push people to make the effort to do it faster? What level of control do you have in this process to for all the different 55 states and territories to complete this quicker? Brad.
Well, again, we have to work with the states and territories. And it would be pointless to roll out a requirement that they can't physically meet just based on their legislative schedules and their ability to stay on top of, monitor, and enforce regulation. Again, we encourage them to move as quickly as they can, but there's no point in releasing something that just places them out of compliance technically with our minimum. Because that carries with it some pretty potentially severe ramifications with regard to their ability to conduct federally related transactions. That, of course, is left up to the appraisal subcommittee on the enforcement side there with states.
Okay. And Jerry, quick question about the approval of the PREA program. Was that a program for licensing only, or for certification, or for certified general?
Good question. So as Brad previously mentioned, the PREA program that the AQB has approved already is the Appraisal Institute's PREA program for licensed residential. So that's what we currently have. We're certainly excited to see providers develop their certified residential programs as well. So again, we do have a number of programs that have already been submitted to the AQB, and we've reviewed and provided feedback on the content outlines to those providers, and we're looking forward to those providers bringing back their final additions to us.
Great, thank you for that, Jerry. Well, I've covered all of the topics that have been put forth in the Q&A in the chat box. So unless Brad and Jerry, you have any comments or anything you want to add, I'm just going to start to wrap up the webinar here today.
I would simply like to thank all who attended. So thank you for sticking with us through this webinar, and I do look forward to getting your comments.
And definitely, as Brett said, thank you for tuning in and staying informed.
Great. And so what we ask for you is always the same thing. Very, very important. What do you think? Do you have comments for the AQB? We can't do our job without you. So please do take the time. If it's a short comment or a long comment, they're all very welcome, and we very much appreciate anything that you send in. If you don't have the exposure draft and you just want to make comments based on what you've heard today, you can just email aqb@appraisalfoundation.org. The board will also accept verbal comments at its virtual public meeting on June 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. You will see a registration link in the chat box, and you can always check our events page and register for the upcoming meetings and webinars. So Brad and Jerry, just a quick last word. I think you guys have already said thank you, so we'll move on and close it out now. Please make sure to fill out the very quick survey at the end as it pops up. And thank you again for attending today, and thank you for being with us, and we hope to hear from you.